Hello everyone. In this video we are going to talk about CSS Flexbox, which is a way that you can control the layout of the elements on your page. Now, in a previous lesson I briefly mentioned floats, hardly at all, but just in passing we saw using the float property. Now that was the old way of laying out a page. Flexbox is a newer way of doing it, and there are other ways, but Flexbox is probably the most flexible one. Okay, anyways, here's what we're going to do. Go ahead and right click on your CSS folder here in VS Code and create a new file, and let's just call it flexbox.html, like that. Okay, and then go ahead and put in your boilerplate code. Let's indent the head and the body elements. That's a good practice that we've been following here. And we'll change the title to be Flexbox, like that. And then we need some elements inside of the body. So here's what we're going to do. Inside the body, we're going to add a div with an ID of container, like this. Div, so type in div, hit enter, and then you can split those tags apart because we'll be putting stuff inside of them. But then go back to the opening tag here and add an ID attribute, and let's set that equal to container. Now this is going to be the container that we're going to be trying to lay out elements within. That's why I gave it that ID of container. Okay, inside of there, we're going to put 3 divs. So we can go ahead and add one, type in div and hit enter, and then we'll just make it say div1. Okay, and now you can duplicate that 2 more times because we're going to need 2 more divs here inside the container. So you can do the Alt-Shift down arrow trick to duplicate those lines, but that's what we need, our 3 divs inside of our container div. I'll change this to div2 and that to div3. And then one last thing we do before we can get into Flexbox is we're going to add a class to this middle div, to div2 here. So add a class attribute and set that equal to a value of bigger. And you'll see why I chose that class name in a bit here. All right, now we're ready to start adding the CSS code here. So go ahead and go back up to the title element. Add a style element, split the style tags apart like that, and now we're ready to go. Let's put a border around all the divs so that we can see them. That'll really help us right here. So in the style element, go ahead and add a rule set where the selector targets all div elements. So that's our selector div, then the curly braces, and then split the curlies apart like that. And let's set the border like this. Border colon 1px solid black semicolon. Okay, and now what that'll do is it'll allow us to see the divs by putting a border around them. Now let's take a look real quick at the page right here. I'm going to save my changes and then open it up in the browser with Alt-B, and mine came up over here, and I'll pull it over to this monitor so you can see it if I can get it here. Okay, now remember that div elements are block level, so they're just stacking vertically, and each one is taking up as much space as it can. It's taking up a whole line here in the browser window. Okay, let's go back to VS Code, and now we can start to talk about Flexbox. So in order to control the layout of these child divs, you have to set the display property on the container. So let's go ahead and do that right now. We'll use an ID selector to target the container div. So ID selector starts with a hashtag, and then we're going to target the element that has its ID set to container, like that. Then come the curly braces, split the curlies apart here. And now what we want to do is set the display property to flex. So type in display inside the curly braces, display colon flex semicolon. Okay, now the effect that this has is it's going to affect the children that are inside the container. So go ahead and save your changes, Control S, and then go back over to the browser and hit refresh and look at how they're behaving right now. They're behaving like inline elements, but we'll see in a bit here that they're not exactly acting like inline elements. Let me show you what I mean here. If we go ahead and go back to VS Code, let's set a height on this container. So go ahead and set the height to 300 pixels, like that. Okay, save it, Alt-Tab back to the browser, hit refresh, and now look at the way these are behaving. These elements are not acting exactly like inline elements because they're stretching out to take up as much space, as much height as they can within their parent. Okay, but notice that they aren't stretching out horizontally. So they're only taking up as much width as they need to accommodate the content that's inside of them. Now we can add other properties to our rule set to control the way these child elements get laid out. They call them flex children, the elements that are inside of a container that has its display property set to flex. So we can call those flex children. So div 1, 2, and 3, those we can say are flex children. Go back over to VS Code, and I want to show you a property you can use here to control the layout of the children. So underneath the height property in that rule set, go ahead, and the property we want to set here is justify content. So there it is, justify dash content. And now here are all your choices here. We're only going to talk about a few of these, but you'll see what we mean here. If we set this to center like that, then save it and go back to the browser and hit refresh. Now the children are centered within the parent. Okay, now there's quite a few of these property values that we can set for the justify content property. We're only going to talk about a few of them here. Let's try changing that from center to space around. Space around like that. Save it, Alt-Tab back to the browser, hit refresh, and now look what it's doing. It's distributing the space around the flex children there. So if this is the kind of layout that you want for your page, then you might want to use space around. Let's try a couple more here. Change it to space between. Back over here. There we go. And now you can see that it's distributing the space in between the elements. So we kind of lose that padding on the sides there. We'll try a couple more. Let's try space evenly. So save that, go back to the browser, hit refresh, and you can see now in this case the space is distributed, the extra space is distributed evenly. So this is the exact same as that and that and that. So it's a little bit different than the space around. All right, go back over to VS Code here, and there's another property that you can use once you set the display to flex on an element, and it's called align items. So here we'll add a property called align items, and there's quite a few different settings we can choose for this, but this allows us to control the vertical layout of the flex children. So if we set it to start here, whoops, not that, start, let's see what that does here. So save that and then go back to the browser and hit refresh. And now you can see they're no longer stretching out, but they're aligning at the start of the container. In other words, the top here like that. Let's try a few more here. Let's set that align items to center. Save that, go back to the browser, and now they're vertically centered within their flex container. There's a few more you could try here. End would put them at the bottom. By default, the value is stretch. So if you don't ever mention this, it's going to be set to stretch, and that's what we saw when we first started looking at these flex children here. So there's a very brief overview of what you can do with the container element. So it all starts by setting the display property to flex. And then once you do that, then you have these other properties, justify content and align items. And you can use those to control the children that are inside this container element. Now let's take a look at what we can do to control the children themselves. So we'll add another rule set here, and this time we're going to target div elements that are nested within the container. So here's what our selector is going to look like: hashtag container space div. So that's going to target the children of our container here, and they are all divs, so it's going to target all of them. Let's go ahead and add a height here first of all. So let's set the height to 100px like that, and then save it and just look at it real quick over here in the browser. And now you can see that their height is 100 pixels. And now we haven't set a width on these, but let's see what happens when we do that. Now, these are flex children, so what we can do is apply a flex property to them. Kind of weird. So add a flex property and set it to 1 like that, and let's see what that does here. Okay, now the width is, now they're taking up as much width as they can. Now, this might be a little bit confusing at first, but it's actually a really cool feature right here. By setting the flex to 1 for all of these divs, that means that between all 3 of them, their width is going to be evenly. So they all have the same flex settings, which was set to 1, which means that they're all going to be the same exact width. Now, in order to control the ratio, let's say I wanted the middle div to be bigger than the other 2. Maybe I want the middle div to be twice as big as divs 1 and div 3. So what I can do here is I'm going to go ahead and add another rule set here, and we're going to specifically target that bigger div. So what we can do is target the div with the class, or the element with the class of bigger, like that. And we can set its flex property to 2. Okay, now that's going to be twice as big as the elements whose flex property is 1. So that's how the flex property works. It's ratios. Save that, and then Alt-Tab back to the browser and hit refresh. Oh, and you know, I ran into a problem here because apparently this isn't specific enough. Actually, what I think I can do to make this more specific is let's try this. I'm going to be real specific here. I'm going to start the selector off with hashtag container, if I can spell it right. And then I'm going to say we want to target divs within the container that have a class of bigger. Okay, now this is much more specific than this rule set here, so I expect the flex property to be set to 2 for that bigger div, that div 2. Save that, Alt-Tab back to the browser, hit refresh, and there you can see that div 2 is twice as wide as the other divs, and that's because we set its flex property to twice as much as the other ones. Okay, now I want to show you something that you can do, and you might not appreciate this unless you've been doing CSS for a while, but it used to be very difficult to control the layout of the content, the text content that's within an element. We had to do all sorts of weird hacks to be able to control that. But now what we can do with Flexbox is we can control the way the text within an element is laid out within that element. So if I go back here, back to this rule set here, where we're targeting the flex children, let's go ahead and set their display property to flex. So do display flex like that. And now what we can do is this allows us to use the justify content and align items to control the layout of the text within them. So here, if I add justify content and set it to center, and let me go ahead and do align items and set that to center. Now that's going to center the text both horizontally and vertically within their flex parent, which is the div. Save that, Alt-Tab back to the browser, and now we've got centered text. Now this, like I said, this was difficult to do before Flexbox. Now we're not going to get into all the different properties that you can use when you set the display to flex on something, because that's a big topic. And we're just doing a brief overview for the purposes of this course. But I do want to show you one more important thing to set you off on your journey into Flexbox. When we set the display property to flex on the container, it made the 3 divs inside of it stack horizontally across. Now that's the default behavior when you set the display to flex on a container, but we can change that here. Let's go back to VS Code, if I can find it here. There it is. And we're going to go back to this rule set right here where we're targeting our flex container here, the one that has the children in it. We can add a property called flex direction. Okay, now by default it lays out everything in a single row, but we can change that to column like this. And now let's see what happens here. If you save your changes and Alt Tab back to the browser here and hit refresh, now the flex children are lining up vertically in a column. Okay, now there is something very important about this. Sometimes this is really handy to be able to do this sometimes. You can still see that the middle div is stretching to be twice as high now, whereas before it was twice as wide. So one thing you have to be careful of is when you do change the flex direction, it changes the axes of your elements. Now what I mean by that is that, and this is confusing, is that we use justify content here to space the div elements horizontally. But if you change the flex direction, that's going to apply vertically. Likewise, we used align items here to align the elements vertically. But once we change the flex direction, this now controls the horizontal positioning of the elements. It's very confusing, but you'll get used to it if you work with Flexbox enough. So when you change the flex direction, you can basically think of rotating the axis that the flex children are on. So that is one confusing thing for people who are learning Flexbox. Okay, as I said, there's so much more to Flexbox, and we're just scratching the surface here in this course. But it's very powerful and you can do a lot of really cool things with it, but there is a learning curve with it. I tried to boil it down to just these basics for you. And that'll do it for this video.